Tatum, did you know this is me playing cello?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rural Journalism Collective. My name is Tatum Fotheringill, and I am with the Rural Assembly and here with my colleagues at Rural Strategies and Daily Yonder and our panelists today. We are really excited to be back after our last panel back in December of last year talking about data, and we're really excited to be talking today about election year reporting. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Caroline in just a moment, but I wanted to mention you had a chance to submit questions when you registered for today's panel, but feel welcome to put more questions in the chat as we go along. We'll have some time at the end to be able to address those. The Rural Journalism Collective is a program of both the Daily Yonder and the Rural Assembly. And so we thank you for being here today. And we are recording this session so that we can share it with more folks later on. You will not have the ability to unmute yourself. So if you do have a question, please put that in the chat and I will be keeping my eye on it. And then I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Caroline, to say hello and introduce our panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tatum. Hi, everyone. We're so excited that you're here. And this is just a fun thing that we've been doing for a couple of years now, intermittently. So I'm really delighted that there continues to be such interest and that you all are taking a little time out of your Thursday to hang out with us. I can't remember if Tatum said this, but we are recording this meeting. I think maybe you did. So if you feel good about having your face in a recording, please, by all means, we'd love to see you. If you're not so keen on that, no worries. You can turn your camera off. Either way is good for us. I am going to start by introducing myself, and then I will call on my panelists to introduce themselves. My name is Caroline Carlson. I am the senior digital editor for the Daily Yonder, and I am here in my living room in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Cathy, you're next on my right on the screen.
Oh, Zoom paralysis. I apologize. This is what happens when speakers are allowed to unmute themselves. I'm Cathy Darling Allen. I am the retired Shasta County, California clerk and registrar of voters, which is our county seat is in Redding, California, which is about 2 hours south of Oregon and 2 hours north of Sacramento, so right in the middle of the state, a little bit landlocked at the top of the Central Valley. Our county seat, Redding, is about 100,000 people, and lots of little small towns in the mountains and the foothills on 3 sides surrounding Redding. And my primary job over the last 20 years has been conducting elections. As a county clerk, there's a whole bunch of other ancillary stuff, but my media focus has been in covering elections and working with local media and unfortunately lately state, national, and international media as well to talk about what's happening in Shasta County.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Pauly?
Yeah, it's a Pauly Denetclaw Hilton Ishlando Kiani Bashishtin Bit Anita Shichedo Ishin. Hi everyone, my name is Pauly Denetclaw. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I am Meadow people born for Towering House people. I'm originally from Gallup, New Mexico, and I'm currently based in Washington, D.C., where I'm a political correspondent for ICT, formerly known as Indian Country Today.
Wonderful. So excited you're here. Dee, would you like to say hi?
I'm Dee Davis. I'm president of Center for Rural Strategies. We're the publisher of the Daily Yonder and the host organization for the Rural Assembly. I'm in Eastern Kentucky, I can see the Virginia border from my back porch. So we're in the Appalachian coalfields.
Excellent. Well, whether or not you're trying to think about it, this is a big year in terms of elections, and that means rural voters especially are going to be in the spotlight. And Dee has spent a lot of his career thinking about issues like this that pertain to rural and rural voters. And we, the Center for Rural Strategies, that is, conducted some really interesting polling recently. Not that you have to go into all of it, Dee, but you know,
Sure.
we've been thinking about this and sort of gearing up for reporting on it. And I wonder if you could just kind of set the stage on how we're framing rural voters.
Right. Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I think that we became reluctant pollers. In one of the maybe 2006, 2007, heading to the next election cycle, Kellogg Foundation brought a number of communications consultants who were working with them, and Democrat pollsters and Republican media consultants, and brought us all together and said, look, we can't get any coverage for rural issues. What do we need to do? And as we would all pull our hair and lament, think of different schemes, we just kept saying, all the media wants to cover is horse race. And finally, Bill Greener, who was managed a couple of Republican national conventions, said, well, if they want a horse race, why don't we give them that? So we then concocted this idea that we would start polling rural voters. Nobody was doing it. And so we enticed National Public Radio with different consultants around the country to come and work with us, and created national polling around rural voters in battleground states. So we were contending that rural voters had a big say in who was going to be elected president, and that the margins were meaningful. And so we began this process as a way to bring up other rural issues about underemployment, healthcare, lots of disenfranchisement issues, immigration. And so it just turned out, accidentally probably, that this rural polling led the NPR's daily feed. It had the most attention, it got the most clicks, the most listeners, the most readers on their website. And so we began this process, which was every so often trying to bring up the issue of rural voters. And though now, if you watched national coverage of elections, rural voters are pretty prominent, and they may not exactly know where rural is, but they talk about rural. It may be that they talk about the suburbs as rural, or maybe they talk about the countryside, but nonetheless, we see more and more of the news networks and the newspapers talk about rural voters, and that was our intent. And it was a start. I don't know that it's elevated the attention to rural issues as we had hoped it would do, but it has made a difference in terms of at least bringing rural into the discourse. And then in this past year, we were engaged again in a set of rural polls and focus groups, and I'll talk about that a little bit later.
That's great. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on, sort of the pros and cons of this bringing rural into the discourse. Not that there are cons, but some folks don't report on rural in a nuanced and accurate way. Can you speak to that, Dee?
I heard somebody say, what's the problem with studying history? And the answer was, we know how it turned out. Well, in some ways, it's kind of like, it's hard now to get back to a place where rural was not paid, nobody was paying attention to rural. When they did, it was all about drought and farmers. Well, 2-3% of rural people live on the farm, but we just could not get any coverage that wasn't about price of corn or wheat or hogs. And so now it's a whole different story. Some of it is, you really wish you didn't have to listen to about rural rage and things like that. But nonetheless, we thought it would be better to tell an accurate story of rural than to have rural left out. And so getting the accuracy is kind of the next goal to be achieved.
Totally. And that's a big part of what we talk about at the Daily Yonder in terms of our election reporting and these sorts of things, how to frame rural voters in an accurate way, because on the one hand, they are really important, obviously, a good chunk of voters. And then on the other hand, often rural voters can be framed as a scapegoat, for all sorts of ills of the country, and that's not the full picture. Pauly, I would like to go to you next, because another part of rural voters that is so often overlooked is the native vote. And I wonder if you could talk about how you've been reporting on this lately.
Yeah, so I say this all the time to folks, the same issues that are faced in rural parts of the United States are faced by Native voters, because Native people often live in extremely rural areas. There are villages in Alaska where you can only get to by plane. There are places in Arizona and New Mexico where you have to drive for hours in order to get to. And so that's something that I really like to highlight when I'm having these discussions. And when it comes to the Native vote, one, I always love to use this opportunity to educate people and make sure folks are understanding of the nuances of when it comes to reporting on Indigenous communities. And so Native American is not a racial classification, it's a political classification. And so Native people are citizens of their own nations. And so that's why I say I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation, because I am a citizen of my nation. And so there are over 500 federally recognized tribes that have citizens and have their own presidents, have their own governments, have their own judicial system, and have their own legislative legislative government. And so when we're talking about the Native vote, we're not only just talking about their involvement in local, state, and federal elections, but we're also talking about their them voting in tribal elections as well. And so I think it's very worthwhile for folks who are interested in covering the Native vote that it does include who's getting elected for tribal office. And that is so often overlooked, especially by non-Native news outlets who often don't think that it is important to cover tribal elections when the Cherokee Nation, the Navajo Nation, the Muskogee Nation are the 3 largest tribes in the United States and have huge influence over what happens in their areas. And Native nations, Indigenous nations are often the biggest drivers of economic development in their rural areas through whether it's gaming or whether it's various other types of enterprises. The Navajo Nation has Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. We have several enterprises that employ both Native and non-Native folks in our area. And so I really do think that it is important that the Native vote does get covered, and also in a way that is rooted in context and nuance. And the Native vote is powerful. You know, we see it swing whole elections. Mary Peltola, Lisa Murkowski, um, in Montana, you know, and in Arizona. And so there are huge races that depend on the Native vote. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. And I'm just so grateful that we have relationships with other outlets like you guys, because this sort of context is so important. And, you know, we at the Daily Yonder try to, you know, one, do a good job of reporting on Native issues, but 2, also consult folks like you, because you're really the expert, and we know that Native is part of rural, but you know, I could not give the same context that you can. So I'm so grateful to have you here and excited. And that, you know, fits in exactly. I love what you said, Pauly, about how you know, Native voters face the same issues as rural voters in rural communities, because I think sometimes it just isn't equated that way, even though, you know, again, reservations are largely rural places, and it's the same sort of stuff. I mean, even access to polling places in rural, like you were saying, in Alaska, in these smaller cities or towns, really, is such a big thing. And Cathy, you've really been on the ground in rural areas, talking to rural people, dealing with rural voters. I'd love to hear sort of just your personal experiences. And I know, especially in Shasta County, there's been some challenging stuff, I'll say. And so please step in and tell us about your experiences.
Sure. I just want to echo what you said about Pauly's comments. Super fascinating. And we have everything you said is true about Northern California. We have, you know, enterprise that is significant, and community involvement and philanthropic contributions from our local tribe that are immensely important to our community. So I appreciate you being here also, and hearing directly from the source is super important, right? Which is what Carolyn said. But to talk about Shasta County a little bit more, the one thing that struck me about Dee's remarks, I hope it's okay for me to riff off of you guys. Rural voters are not a monolith. And I think a lot of times at the national level, the federal level, I hear from national media, and they want to talk about, what they've decided rural voters are. And, they're just almost always wrong. So I'm thrilled that, that y'all are doing the polling that you're doing and kind of bringing that to the forefront. I think that's really valuable and important. We have had in our office, in the elections office in Shasta County, a really great working relationship with local media for the 2 decades that I was in office, and I'm really proud of that. And I'm really grateful to the independent local media that we have in Shasta County. We had an independent newspaper that had an amazing giant building and printed here in Reading. And unfortunately in 2016, that local paper was purchased by USA Today. So it's part of Gannett now. And we just, a newsroom of 30 people or so now is down to, I think, 5-ish. They just this week went to postal delivery of the paper, which honestly is appropriate because it's so thin and emaciated at this point that there really isn't any reason for a separate delivery mechanism. And so again, I'm really grateful for the local media that we have that are independent and all online, but that has, removing the burden of producing news. We have TV stations, of course, and lots of local radio as well, but I think we're focused mainly on print, right? Or print-ish, right? Sort of. So I guess also I wanted to just comment, and I'm kind of all over the place here, I apologize. It is such a hugely important partnership between the elections department, the county functions, or the city or township in many states. Whoever's conducting elections in your community, that partnership between you and the government entity that's conducting elections is really important to educate voters. California is lucky in that we are mandated to provide written materials to voters about candidates, ballot issues, et cetera. Not every state has that requirement. And so in many cases, folks show up to go to the polls with no information except what they have gleaned from their local rural media. And so partnerships and participation with local media is super, super important. And so that's why we've always fostered those relationships and tried to make sure that we were inviting all of our local media into the process. We've had a lot of attention in Shasta County because of some of the actions of our governing board. In California, we have boards of supervisors, which are like county commissioners in other states. And they, in early 2023, I'm just going to talk about this very briefly so that folks have some context. They made a decision to cancel our voting system contract without any plan of how our citizens could vote going forward, which obviously created a huge controversy and lots, as I said, lots of media attention. I've been quoted in papers in the UK and in the Far East and Singapore, just kind of really all over the place. There's been articles in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Sacramento Bee, Los Angeles Times, and kind of everywhere in between, right? Talking about what our governing board is trying to do to elections in our community. So, but the best coverage has been by our local folks and those local independent journalists. And I'm super grateful for that. And I'm grateful for their time and attention. It just is a really valuable service that rural journalists provide all over the country. Can I leave it there?
Yeah. I would love to direct your attention to the chat, Cathy, because there's a question that I think you might be able to help us with a little bit. What do you think the rural news sources did right in developing their side of the partnership with the local government? So how can journalists sort of foster these relationships in a meaningful and mutually beneficial way?
I think, especially in this very contentious universe of elections administration that we're all living in, whether we're talking about Shasta County or Chicago, Illinois, right? There's the process of conducting elections is very much under the microscope and under fire. So kind of avoiding the gotcha moments is really important. Um, all of I started working in elections in my mid-30s, and I had a lot of professional experience, working. I had many jobs before that, and the thing about elections that people who don't work in the field don't know is that we are a almost universally group of election nerds. We love this shit, excuse my French, but we are passionate about what we do, and we really want every single person to vote, no matter what my personal political opinions are. I want every person who lives in our community to have a chance to have their voice heard. And every person I've ever met in elections from Maine to Arizona feels the same way. It's probably similar to what y'all do, and really wanting to make sure you're doing the very best job you can to report the details to support your community. We very much feel that we are in service to our community. That's a huge kind of value that I think is universal across elections administration. Nobody's getting rich conducting elections, I promise you that. I did not take office with no assets, and I left office 6 months ago. I didn't leave office a millionaire like many other politicians do, right? But I think that developing those relationships, finding common ground, and having an ongoing relationship and ongoing conversations. If the only time I see you in my office is 3 days before the election and you want an hour and a half of my time, you're not going to get it, because I don't know you and I don't trust you. But if you're a journalist who I've talked to once a month for the 12 months prior, I mean, this is just basic relationship building and networking, right? That's not really complicated. You don't need to bring us cookies, but check in, especially now in this current climate, check in on your election officials. They are under stress. They are under pressure. They are being harassed and intimidated and lied about. And I think I can say that with some confidence about every single election official in the country right now. There are a lot of bad actors spreading lies about how elections are conducted right now. I used to say a year ago, I was saying misinformation, and it's lies. It's just lies, folks. And so not giving those folks oxygen as much as you can. Obviously, you have to report in an even-handed way, and I get that, but not repeating specifically debunked information. Our local newspaper has done a great job of every time they talk about some of the allegations that have been made about our department, they talk about the debunked theory of X or Y. They're very careful to couch those allegations in the light that they should be couched in, which I appreciate. So is that helpful?
I think that's super helpful. And I just want to say thank you for the work that you put in your community. I know that it's really important stuff, and it's really lovely to hear straight from you about how journalists can best do this, because obviously this year it's extra crucial. There's a question in the chat that I want to open up to all three of you. What's preventing rural voters from getting to the polls? Are there any barriers that aren't being reported on? I think maybe the one that comes to mind often is just transportation, getting to the polling place in areas that are more remote and spread out. But I'm curious, Dee or Pauly, if you can think of anything that maybe isn't so obvious.
So actually, I did want to, there is a report by the Native American Rights Fund called Barriers at Every Turn. It's a 2020 report that it is extremely detailed about the issues that Native voters face. And it's not just the distance, it's the fact that there aren't enough voter registrations around. People have to drive in order to even register to vote. IDs are a huge barrier as well, because there are a lot of folks who don't have access to a motor vehicle division, who can't go, 2 hours to the city to be able to renew their licenses. There's issues around access to the internet, broadband access. And so even if you do have these ways of, renewing your license or renewing these things online, they're often not available, especially for extremely rural communities, like Indigenous nations. And so it very much is the fact that it's like all the way from the very top until it goes to the election. There are barriers at every single point that increase the amount of burden that especially Native voters have to go to in order to be able to vote and cast their ballots. And so I just really highly recommend everybody to look at that report. It talks about all of the barriers that Indigenous nations face. And now, because Native nations and Indigenous voters, Native voters, are seen as more democratic, they vote for Democrats more often than not, which is true. There's also misinformation happening. And so there are people who are specifically targeting Native voters and spreading misinformation about dates of the election, about voter registration. I have even heard of folks who are claiming to register people for voting and are not actually doing that. They're just hired to like take people's information and then they just like toss the stuff away. And so I think that it is really important that, these are some of the issues that Native voters face in particular.
Yeah, I would just say there's always been tricksters, but in reality, voting has been pretty accurate and responsible, and for the last couple of decades, and now, because of a narrative that there is corruption in voting, you're seeing more and more barriers. You're seeing fewer polling places. You're just seeing it. It's hurting both sides in the political debate, because as it becomes more difficult, maybe one side thinks they're putting their thumb on the scales, and maybe they win one cycle because of it. But in the long run, democracy is what's hurt. And I used to be able to walk down to the library and vote, and we have a nice chat. Now I've got to drive several miles and be in very long lines. And you kind of lose the participatory spirit.
In California, and I think I'm really sorry to hear that story, Pauly, that you told about people fraudulently registering voters. That's not acceptable. Not only from a kind of identity theft concern, right? Because now your personal information's out there in the world and you don't even know where it went. Anyway, California is not a battleground state, right? But we have a lot of rural communities. And if you look at like a red and blue map, the places that are blue in California are our population centers, which is the Bay Area and in Southern California. Everywhere else is red, and maybe a little purple in some of those counties. But so we have a lot of concern about the narratives that are being propagated by some of the national media outlets, and this whole climate in which if we don't like the election results, then there was definitely fraud. That narrative is unfortunately echoed very strongly here in Shasta County. But because we are still in California, we now mail a ballot to every single voter. So whether you have a ride to the polls or not, your ballot is delivered to you, and the postage is paid on return. So that's a huge, we hope, encouragement to folks who do live in very remote areas. And our furthest polling place from our county seat is a 2-hour drive into the mountains. So we do have very rural and far-reaching polling places. And we have reduced the number of polling places to talk about to address Dee's point. when I started in 2003, we had 105 polling places open at a presidential election. Now we're down to 60 because the increase in vote by mail, which has been really organic in our community. Before, we didn't go to all mail delivery of ballots until COVID, until 2020. But prior to that, we were over 75% vote by mail, just like I say, organically, because it's convenient for folks. But I think the things that we didn't talk about as far as rural folks being disenfranchised too, language access is a big one, right? Voters who don't, English is not their first language or don't feel comfortable doing what is essentially a legal transaction in English, sometimes have a hard time. That can disenfranchise folks for sure. And just to finish my thought about the number of polling places that we have open, what we have done, just for your information, Dee, is in our more urban centers, we have 3 incorporated cities inside the county. And so in those cities, we have fewer places. But for example, that polling place that's 2 hours away, those places are all still open. Our more far-flung, smaller communities is where we keep those polling places open with intention, because those are the places where voters actually know their poll workers, right? In the middle of Reading, we can put anybody we want in a chair at a polling place to work, and they may or may not see a neighbor that they know. But when you go up to Bernie in the Intermountain area, those 5 or 6 ladies and gentlemen know the people who are walking through the door, and they want to know them, and they want to have the potluck on election day, or make fudge for every voter gets a piece of fudge at one of our polling places. But that doesn't happen in town, right? So that's a little bit different.
And I just wanted to add to what Cathy was saying about languages. Navajo is one of the major like after English and Spanish in Arizona and New Mexico is the 3rd most commonly spoken language. And so the issue that is at hand, though, is that even though Navajo does reach the requirement to have a translated like ballot, a lot of Navajo people, it's an oral language. So a lot of Navajo people are not literate in the Navajo language. And so they can't read it. Like my mom is fluent in Navajo. She's like, she knows extremely intricate words that a lot of people who know Navajo conversationally don't know. And so she can't read it. Whereas oddly enough, I can read Navajo, but I don't know what I'm saying. And so like I'm like reading these things to my mom, and she's like, it sounds like you can speak Navajo. And I'm like, yeah, so what does it say? And so that is also part of this, is that there are a lot of older Navajo speakers. Even if they do understand English, they're not it's not their first language. It's not how they talk every single day in their life to their family, to their friends, to their community, to their doctors at the hospital. And so it is another barrier for Native voters whose first languages are Native languages. And so one of the things that I did also want to bring up was the Native American Voting Rights Act is going through Congress right now, and would address that issue, and making it mandatory that there are Native language speakers there to translate the ballot for people who need it. At my community, there's 400 voters at Annualito Chapter House, and thankfully, my family members are poll workers. And so they're over there helping our elders in our community, and they're translating ballots for them, or helping their family members to translate ballots so that they're able to vote. And so those are some of the workarounds that we have been able to find in our community, even though it's not addressed legislatively.
California has the California Voting Rights Act that was passed several years ago. And so we have to comply with the federal Section 203 language requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act, but then we also have additional languages county by county that have to do with usually census data information and folks' comfort. I think that's the thing that's important for folks, to lay people to understand, and maybe even journalists to understand about how languages are covered by some of these laws. it's really important to remember that every state has different rules about how elections are conducted. But in the federal standard and in California, and hopefully we'll get additional languages if that legislation is successful, probably that would be great. But it's about how comfortable folks are. And when they answer that question on the census, that's the census data stuff, is how comfortable are people using that language, right? And using English. That's one of those questions that the census asks that helps determine some of those languages.
This is such a rich conversation already, and I'm just so grateful to all of you for jumping in and these points. And Pauly, I was getting heated myself just hearing you talk about some of that stuff going on. I'm enraged, frankly. So I have two questions concerning funding for this sort of reporting, you know, to support communities like this. One came to me directly, and it specifically is concerns Native voters, and what, if any, are there non-Native news media outlets that are offering comprehensive coverage of Native elections? I know ICT does great stuff, but are you the only ones doing it? And what role do you think philanthropy might be able to play in helping bridge this gap? Do you have thoughts on that, Pauly?
Yeah, so I'll just talk about my community because it's what I know the best. So the Gallup Independent for a long time did not cover Navajo elections. There's a lot of racism in border towns, especially against Native American people. And so our community is mostly Navajo in Gallup, as well as there are white folks and then also Hispanic folks. And so our newspaper, the Gallup Independent, largely catered to white and Hispanic readers. And so they were not covering the Navajo Nation. And that changed when the editor-in-chief became a Navajo woman. And so after that, it was very important for them to cover Navajo elections. You know, the focus changed a little bit there. But with that came a lot of readers. And so while the Gallup Independent was struggling, you know, they had to cut the amount of, it's supposed to be a daily newspaper. They had to cut the amount of days that they were printing the newspaper. You know, there was a period of time where I could not find a newspaper for my mother. I went to 3 gas stations, all sold out everywhere. And so when that shift happened, they saw an increase in their number of readership because they were catering to a larger percentage of their community. And so I think that when there are places like Gallup or Farmington, these border towns to Native nations, one, there's an untapped economic, you know, folks there who will buy and purchase, you know, newspapers that cover their community if they see themselves reflected in it. And so the other thing that I did want to say is that again, it starts with Indigenous journalists sort of being in these places, but KOB had Colton Schoen, which is one of our New Mexico TV stations, and he's Navajo. And so he started covering Navajo Nation elections. And so because he started covering it at KOB, then KOAT started covering Navajo elections, which is our huge TV station here in New Mexico. And so it's like, it sort of moves in that direction. Source New Mexico is another non-Native news outlet, although the editor-in-chief is Native American. He's from 3 different pueblos in New Mexico. And so those are non-Native news outlets who are run by Native people, but are non-Native news outlets. Most of the reporters there are non-Native, and they cover tribal elections. And so there are non-Native news outlets that do cover these elections, and it's often led by Indigenous journalists and editors. But there is a huge benefit to covering these elections. And the philanthropic, I'm so sorry. I'm a political correspondent. I don't really deal with sort of the back end like funding type of things. So the only thing that I can say on that is that there often isn't enough money going into just reporting and coverage that isn't so hyper specialized to like a specific topic, right? So I think that that continues to be an issue that I run into when I see these reporting grants. I'm like, the money would be great, but it's like so focused in an area that I wouldn't know what to do. And so having more funding available that is more open-ended, that supports a newsroom and what their needs are, I think is something that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, that's so awesome, and a perfect segue to broaden it out a little bit. Dee, I think maybe you would be the guy to answer or to speak to how many philanthropic funders are supporting this kind of work, and you know, our rural journalism outlets even receiving funding for covering elections, covering rural voters, that sort of thing. What can philanthropies do to help?
I think with the faltering income streams for journalism, for newspapers in the last 20 years, philanthropy's done a lot to try to make a difference and to support local coverage. But the nature of the beast is that philanthropies are based in urban areas almost exclusively. And the models that they choose, even though they may not exclude rural coverage, make it pretty hard for rural outlets or rural journalists to get Knight Foundation money or MacArthur Foundation money that's set up for these journalism adventures. So they're not excluded. It's just that the gods they worship are different from the gods we worship.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Let's see. There was a question in the chat about how we're sharing the data from our polling, how folks can access that. Tainum so helpfully dropped a link somewhere in the middle there to our polling results, which are all available on our website. So feel free. We've done some reporting ourselves at the Daily Yonder on what we found, and then other news outlets, including I think the New York Times, have linked to these findings. So we're really pleased with that in terms of how these more nuanced takes on rural are getting out there.
So if I could
Go
say,
ahead.
yeah, this what we saw in the polls that we did last year that were different. So, you know, there's been shifts for sure. And, you know, Clinton and Gore won rural America, and now it's about 2-1 in terms of votes for Trump. So, you know, you've had a pretty big shift, but we did some focus groups and we did some work around messaging, and it was what was different this time and interesting was just the amount of resonance that populist messages got across party divisions. That is, if you made the statement that pharmacies or big pharmaceutical companies have their foot on the throat of Americans, and they're they're gouging prices for insulin or different drugs. All of a sudden, oil companies, people who, when we were doing the polling, inflation had become quite a problem, but the remedies were often to look out at corporate America and to lay some blame. And this was a set of messages that we've not heard in the last 20 years. So it was interesting. And I'm now hearing both parties use this kind of anti-big business populism in their campaign ads. So you just might want to be aware of that that a lot of things are steady. They don't shift in ways that you see it, but this seems to be a departure from the discourse.
Yeah, and I'm genuinely proud to be associated with or an organization doing this work, because it's really important and cool and interesting, you know, just from a sort of intellectual level. We are nearing the end of this session, and as always, I'm so impressed and kind of surprised that the questions just keep rolling in, and folks are so engaged. So I'm really, thank you so much for being here and for joining our conversation. You know, it doesn't always happen that a Zoom call is this fruitful and this excellent. So I'm, you know, I hate to do this, but I'm just gonna ask one last question. And I'll kind of try to roll a few things together here. So the big question is how are we keeping rural communities in the news loop in terms of voting and elections, and how you know, what are other emerging ways of reporting and distributing news to rural places, and you know, how are we making sure that this is a viable thing, journalism in general, a profession, not just a hobby, as someone put it. And so I'm just gonna do just a really quick overview of kind of what we're doing here at the Daily Yonder, because I was speaking about this actually on a panel last week at a conference. And we not only, of course, publish digital journalism, our written reporting, we're also really looking at audio. And so we have a weekly newscast that is called the Yonder Report, and that is broadcast on, I believe, in 49 states. So if we could get Kansas, that would be great if you know anyone. And it's a really wonderful thing that we're doing that goes on commercial radio, and so even if folks are just listening in their cars or whatever, they're getting real fact-checked rural news from us, which we're really pumped about. We've also been partnering with local NPR affiliate stations to get some of our larger podcasts out. We've done one on the history of meth. We are, spoiler alert, working on one about rural voters. So I really encourage you to keep an eye out for that. It's not out yet, but it will be coming up here, and that's going to be a really great series. I believe it's 4 or 5 parts. Don't quote me on that. Our multimedia folks will probably jump on me after the end of this call for not saying it right. And then, you know, we're experimenting with ways of supporting local news ecosystems with sort of geographically placed reporters. And there are wonderful organizations out there that we know and love. Report for America, American Journalism Project is doing good stuff, but they often end up in urban places, and they're also tied to one outlet, one publication. And so what we are experimenting with doing here at the Daily Yonder, and I'm not saying, you know, we've hit the solution, but we're just trying new things, throwing throwing stuff at the wall to see if it sticks, is having someone who's supported editorially by us. So the local newsrooms don't have to, invest so much time and effort in a reporter, but all of our, we're a nonprofit, all of our stuff is republishable for free. And so we can support someone from an editorial standpoint, and then they can support a number of local news outlets in their region with stories that are both aimed particularly locally and also a more national lens, and those ones with a more national scope that are still pertinent to these communities are also published on the Daily Yonder website. So I've rattled on, and Tainum is probably like, oh my gosh, we have to stop. But I wonder if each of our panelists could just give sort of a one sentence, I don't know, overview of what you think about this stuff, or if there's anything that you forgot to mention. This is truly your last chance. Dee, do you want to go first?
I would just say that we oftentimes think of democracy just in terms of voters, and well, there's 52% of people voted this way and 48%, so that's the way that state is, or that's the way that region is. But what we don't always think of is other kinds of institutions that are democratic. How you show up, how you help your neighbor, how you participate in your community, how you look after people who need help. I mean, those are the core tenets of democracy. And if we lose sight of that, then it's easy to fall into kind of a heated political debate where we have a hard time finding our way forward.
Pauly, do you want to jump in? Anything?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to, in the same way that you all have said that rural folks are not a monolith, like Native communities and Native voters are not a monolith. And so there are so many differing opinions, so many, Native voters in Oklahoma are mostly Republican. Most of the candidates in Oklahoma who are Indigenous are Republican. In Alaska, we see the same thing where they're either nonpartisan, Republican. There are a few Democrats in Alaska. And we see the same things in Arizona and New Mexico, where they're not a monolith. All of these communities are unique and they face differing challenges. And so for Native voters, though, I've interviewed folks from all across the country, and what I seem to keep hearing all the time in terms of what's important to them is infrastructure, economic development, job creation, housing, gas prices, all issues that impact rural communities. And so that's just what I want to leave you all with today.
Thank you so much. Cathy, you have 1 minute.
Just, sincerely, election departments can't do this work without partnership with y'all. And I just think it's a great thing that you're focusing on it, and vote,
Yes.
register and vote.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Well, we're right on the top of the hour, so we've really got it dialed in here. I just want to thank all of you for being here, for chatting. I'm so sorry that we haven't gotten to some of the questions. This always happens, but it looks like there may be some ideas in there for future discussions. So stay tuned. And Tainum, do you have any last words?
I do. Thank you, Caroline, and thanks everybody for joining us, and to our panelists. We will be uploading this recording on YouTube if you'd like to revisit anything later on. And I wanted to put one more shout out. If you'd like to continue having conversations like this, please join us at Rural Assembly Everywhere on August 1st. There will be an opportunity to listen in on a lot more conversations of this nature. And we'll have some workshops the following week as well to connect and learn more together. So I hope I'll see many of you there, and we will let you all know just as soon as we know when the next Rural Journalism Collective event will be, and look forward to seeing you back there then. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your Thursday. Thanks, everybody. And panelists, could you stay on for one moment? Thank you. Thanks, everyone.